A few weeks ago, I built my first ever racing drone. In fact, it was actually my first ever build of any kind. But if you watched last week's video, you'd know that it was an emotional roller coaster where I made a few catastrophic mistakes, but unfortunately, the ones mentioned there weren't actually all of them. To make sure you're covered, I've got 10 mistakes ready to share, all of which I made during my first drone build, and we'll also be pulling the drone apart to fix some of these mistakes too. My first mistake occurred in the research phase, which was unfortunately a result of my sheer excitement. When buying all of the parts for the build, I didn't really do too much research and just based most of the build off of 533's pre-built options. I then ran it past a few FPV friends who said it all looked sweet and would work great, no worries. Although they were 100% correct and all of the parts do work perfectly fine together, there was actually a better decision that I could have, maybe should have made, had I done a bit more research first. In my case, instead of purchasing a Crossfire receiver along with a Unify Nano video transmitter, I would have been better off getting myself a component called the 69. It is essentially a cheaper component that combines both the Crossfire receiver and the video transmitter into one. Had I bought this initially, I would have saved myself from not only one, but two more mistakes that I'll mention very soon. Looking back, this research phase actually ended up being pretty solid, but for someone else on their first build, just double check that what you're buying is the best value and the right component for your build. The second mistake is again in regards to the research phase. Going into this build, I had absolutely no idea about half the components and equipment I had bought. And this led to many hours wasted where I was consistently being left confused. So let's run through everything on the surface level to make sure you know exactly what you're working with. Firstly, the frame. This will of course change for every brand, but one thing that is worth noting is that if something isn't fitting right, have a bit of a look online and see if it needs to be filed down. That was indeed the case with the switchback arms to make them fit. I needed to file the ends down, which helped ensure a super snug fit.
Looking really good.
Next up is your electrical components. Here's the basics of what you'll need. A 4-in-1 ESC, a capacitor with battery leads, a flight controller, 4 motors, a camera, a VTX or video transmitter, and an RX or receiver module. The 4-in-1 ESC, also known as an electronic speed controller, is what talks directly with your motors and supplies power to the other components in your drone. A quick tip on why it's called a 4-in-1 ESC2 is because it actually is home to 4 ESCs, one for each motor. Not too many years ago, these ESCs were all completely separate and used to be mounted to each arm of the quad. You can still 100% do it this way, but the 4-in-1 ESCs make life so much more simple, and it also looks a whole lot cleaner too. Connected directly to your ESC board is your capacitor with battery leads, and of course your motor wires. If we follow your ribbon cable from the ESC up, that takes us to the flight controller, which has got the camera, video transmitter, and remote receiver hooked up to it. To put it into real simple terms, the flight controller is basically the brains of your build, and it needs to be programmed with some form of software like Betaflight to get up and running. It takes your camera's video feed and pumps it out through your video transmitter, which is then received by your goggles, allowing you to see what the drone's camera is seeing. The flight controller also gets signal in through your receiver module, something like Crossfire or ELRS. This module is receiving a signal input straight from the remote controller and then is essentially turning those signals into making your drone move. Something real simple that I'm now learning the hard way is funnily enough to do with these screws here that hold the stack or tower. I was of the understanding that these nuts went on last for some reason, and as of right now, they are literally like that. What should have happened here is these nuts should have secured these screws in place, and then a further 4 nuts should have been used to lightly hold the flight controller and ESC in place. So yeah, I'm going to fix this now, but while I'm spending the next 100 hours trying to do this, let's move on to mistakes 3 and 4. I say 3 and 4 because these two really went hand in hand. As I was first building my quad, I didn't install the additional wiring for Betaflight Smart Audio or Team Black Sheep's My VTX. These are two fairly similar methods of changing the video transmission channels and really any other settings on my video transmitter. This is an essential function needed for me, especially for race days, when I need to be quickly and constantly changing my VTX channel, but even just for general interference when I'm out flying, it's always good to be able to change the channel too. I ended up going to a friend's house who tried to help me sort this issue out. However, unfortunately, we did end up frying the smart audio port by plugging 5-volt power into it accidentally. This is mistake 4, by the way. Make sure you are double and maybe even triple checking that you have got the correct wires going to the correct ports before powering up. This mistake has led me to purchase the TBS 69, which already has the VTX and RX linked together, enabling TBS My VTX straight out of the box. It's also a bit more of a cleaner setup and can be mounted to my stack instead of just having the VTX and RX hanging around the place. Whilst I've got the drone open, I've decided I'm going to install this too. At least now we have a solid 4 screws to mount the 69 to. As you can see, we have properly installed the nuts to the frame. It does feel a whole lot more solid and should help reduce any gyro interference that I might have given myself by missing this step initially. Installing the 69, however, does require soldering, and that brings us perfectly into mistakes 5 and 6. I've got a small background with soldering from way back when I used to modify Nerf guns here on this channel. I never actually learned the proper ways of soldering back then and continued to make the same mistakes going into this build. My solder joints were not good at all. In fact, I would go as far as to say they were genuinely terrible. Some of the ESC pads to motor wires were actually coming loose after a few crashes, and I had the wires stripped back way too long, making the risk of shorting things out extremely high. I know it can seem really tedious to go and learn the proper way to solder, but in the long run, I personally see it as the only way to go. Since the initial build, all of the pads have been resoldered with the help of my friend from earlier, who has been building drones for a great number of years. Since then, I've watched through a thorough tutorial by Joshua Bardwell, which is linked in the description below. I'd highly recommend that you have a watch through the whole video, or at the very least from 27 minutes onwards. So, mistake 5 is not understanding how to solder properly, and mistake 6 is to use additional flux. I have no idea what exactly flux does within solder, but what I can tell you is adding a little bit extra makes soldering a million times easier. A good tip from my friend is that if something isn't working out while you're soldering, you're probably doing something wrong. It could be as simple as not having a hot enough pad, or that the wire wasn't tinned beforehand. Just take your time, learn the technique, and things will be way easier. With all that in mind, I'll start the soldering of the 69 wires to my flight controller and get that side of things underway. I'm not sure how solid my soldering is yet, but this is all part of the process, and all I can do from here is get better, right? Mistakes 7, 8, and 9 are very simple, but very important to not make. Mistake 7 is cutting and stripping my wires too long. I'm not only referring to the actual length of my wires, but also the exposed tips. This mistake caused a short circuit within my ESC, which completely stopped the drone from flying. Basically, the wires were well exposed coming out from the ESC pads, and should have only been the length of the pad with the insulation meeting the side of the board. This reduces the possibility of shorts immensely and may very well be the fix to any problems you might experience. Mistake 8 is not installing the ribbon cable between your ESC board and the flight controller properly. After a crash or two, my drone refused to arm and instead greeted me with an RPM filter issue. Obviously, I had no clue what that meant, but at the end of the day, it wasn't the actual issue. What happened was initially I hadn't installed the plug between the ESC board and the flight controller snugly enough, and the impact from the crash had just popped one of those sides out. This meant the flight controller was still receiving power and appeared to be fully functional. However, due to my ribbon cable connection error, the flight controller wasn't talking properly with my ESC board and wouldn't allow me to arm. Mistake 9 is possibly one of the worst beginner mistakes I made. You know that lovely clear heat shrink that most RXs and VTXs come with? Yeah, well, I neglected that entirely, and if you watched the original build video, you'd know just how bad that ended up for me. The short story here is the naked VTX and RX had their metal components touch other metal components, which killed my video and transmission mid-air, resulting in a pretty serious crash. Alright, I've now soldered the drone up with some solid connections, installed my new RX and VTX module, which seats beautifully onto my properly connected stack screws. I think it's fair to say that it's looking much cleaner now, has all of the VTX controls that I need for racing, and now just needs to be booted up. Before we do that though, just keep in mind that what you're about to experience is mistake number 10. I am sorry. Please, for the love of God, do not add a startup song. I promise you that it's real fun for the first 10 times, and then after that, it slowly starts to kill you on the inside. If you want to watch my emotional roller coaster of an experience building my first ever drone, you can do that here. Otherwise, make sure to subscribe.